So, for the purposes of today's dialogue, I thought we would start something, really easy,
Yeah.
totally non-controversial. So let's jump into it. Abortion. So Alan Dershowitz actually said that, what was the quote? Everyone is right when it comes to abortion, which obviously makes, me lean in a little bit. Our job is to figure out who's more right and, what the hell we're supposed to do about it. And, it strikes me, Ken, that, that this issue, more than really anything else on this list, this seems to be the central fault line in our culture wars, right? I mean, it's the issue that in many ways kind of broke our politics 40 years ago when it first began to get heavily politicized during, the Reagan campaign. And when it comes to single issue voters, I don't really think there's any other single issue that has as many unmovable voters as this one, to the point where, a lot of people are going to actually vote against their own interests, as long as an anti-abortion stance is included, which makes this, that much more complicated. And the fact that people aren't really talking to each other. They're sort of talking across each other. Because until now, this debate has largely been stalled somewhere between, what I'll just call bad metaphysics on the one side and bad materialism on the other. We've got the sort of the amber, every sperm is sacred fundamentalist view. Then there's the orange, fetuses are just parasites until they're born, which is, kind of profane. And, meanwhile, I think green is just pissed off at us that, we have two men talking about this issue right now. So, I thought we would do, Ken, is I wanted to set the table just a little bit here for this issue. And then, I really want to hear what you say. Because as I was researching this, particularly that divide between amber and orange approaches to abortion, I started, doing a little bit of research around, what does the Bible have to say about abortion? So what is sort of the framework that a lot of the fundamentalist views, anti-abortion views, are coming from? And, it was interesting. First off, one of the things I found is that the only actual explicit mention of abortion in the Bible is actually a recipe for an abortifacient, which is found in, where was it? Numbers 5:11 through 31. And the whole idea here was that this abortifacient was to be given to a woman if she was suspected of adultery. As far as I know, that's the only actual mention of abortion in the entire Bible. But that said, the Bible does have a few things to say about the idea of when does life begin, which is obviously, paramount to this issue. And what I found was that, first off, the idea is that the first human being, Adam, became a living being when God blew into his nostrils and he started to breathe. So the idea being here that life begins with the first breath. So life begins when the baby actually comes out of the womb. Thus the word spirit, which literally means to breathe. And then in Exodus, there's a sort of a famous story. There's a case where a woman gets in between two men who are arguing and gets injured. And that injury causes her to miscarry. If the woman had been killed in that injury, their sort of eye for an eye legal system would have demanded the death of the man who injured her. But in the Bible, the miscarriage was actually treated as a property loss, not as a murder, which, doesn't say a whole lot for how much respect the Bible is affording to children and fetuses.
All right.
It's actually interesting, Ken, because in a certain way, orange has brought in I think more compassion in a certain kind of sense. Most orange views look at this as a question of viability. At what point is a fetus viable? At what point can it be born and be independent? And they usually peg it around 24, 26 weeks or something like that. Then on the other side of the controversy, we have a lot of concerns around, what people are calling late-term abortions. And before we talk about this, because it is deeply controversial and deeply troubling, I think we should probably throw a little bit of data on the table. It turns out that abortions that take place after 21 weeks make up only 1.3% of all abortions in the United States. Abortions that occur beyond 24 weeks makes up less than 1% of all procedures. And almost all of these procedures, when it is done, are due to the viability of the fetus. You know, things like the organs are growing outside of the fetus's body and, you know, just doesn't have really a good chance for a good life, or when it's, you know, the mother's life is in danger. Those seem to be really the only time that these quote unquote late term abortions are allowed. And when it comes to this issue sort of more globally, you know, it seems to me that one of the problems that we're stuck in, Ken, is that conservative thinking really seems to emphasize what's called direct causation, which is when they're facing complex issues. It's things like, you know, I've got an immigration problem, so build a wall. You know what I mean? It's typically like, what is the simplest, almost brute force solution to this very complex problem? Liberals, on the other hand, tend to emphasize systemic causation. And the idea here isn't that one is any more right than the other, sort of globally. It's that one is more or less appropriate for a particular issue at a particular time. So when it comes to issues like this, you know, the conservatives are often prohibitionists. They want to make abortions illegal. They want to teach abstinence-only sex education. They want to limit access to birth control. While the liberals tend to be, you know, sort of like mitigation. They want to, you know, maybe influence some of the factors that are feeding into this without sort of a more of a brute force solution. Interestingly, this dynamic sometimes reverses itself. Oftentimes the liberals are the prohibitionists, particularly when it comes to things like gun control and tobacco and so forth. But this does seem to be sort of a common thing that we see on the left and the right. So from an integral point of view, Ken, it seems to me that, you know, the answer is actually kind of simple. We want to implement the policy that results in the greatest good for the greatest span, which means reducing suffering however and wherever we can, which means lowering the total number of abortions that are happening. And it just so happens that studies are showing again and again that that solution is actually to legalize abortion and, you know, to offer extensive sex ed and access to contraceptives. But it's, you know, it's tricky because obviously, you know, we've got a good plurality of the country who doesn't believe that. They actually, you know, we're sort of trapped in the interior versus exterior scale that we talked about a couple months ago, where, you know, to a lot of conservatives, this is an issue, this is an interior issue of sexual morality, right? That's why they don't want sex education. That's why they don't want birth control. They want you to not have sex until you get married. They want it to be, you know, meaningful. They want it to be all of these things. And I think that is, you know, that's totally fine for them to hold that station, but it gets really complex when it comes to, you know, creating policies that impact the entire nation. And a final note here, Ken, is something I often use when trying to navigate issues like this is actually, you know, from the Declaration of Independence. I sort of use this as a North Star when thinking through some of these issues. Namely, it's the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the thing here, and I think this is interesting actually, the thing here is I don't think those three are co-equal, which to me is really profound. I think there's a hierarchical relationship between life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In other words, you know, you have a right to pursue happiness, but not at the expense of my liberty. You have the right to pursue your liberty, but not at the expense of my life. And this lens, you know, brings me a lot of clarity. It's often very useful when I think about issues like this, particularly when it comes to gun control and healthcare and stuff like that. But it gets kind of short-circuited when I'm trying to apply it to abortion, because we're talking about the life and the liberty of both a fetus and an adult woman, and trying to determine who's more entitled to those rights and how to sort of enact this on a policy level. So all that said, what is an integralist to do? When do rights start? And is there something in your mind between sort of the extreme pro-life and the extreme pro-choice stances?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of background issues that we can talk about here. And these are just such fundamental, integral elements that they really have an impact on an enormous number of items, well, throughout the universe, really, but certainly as well in our own culture and in our own society. And we can start with just the definition of a holon. And one of the things that we're constantly dealing with, probably one of the central arguments in any cultural arrangement, and certainly in the different political orientations and in our culture wars, is the whole notion of rights and responsibilities, or rights and duties. And there does tend to be a distinction where liberals focus on, these are your rights, this is what you get to do, and conservatives focus, and these are your duties, these are the responsibilities that you have to do. There's an enormous amount of argument there, and there are groups that they just completely polarize. There are some that talk only about rights and just an individual liberty, and those tend to be libertarians, of course. And then there are those that focus just on duties and responsibilities and collectives, and those tend to be socialist, communist sorts of orientations. But what we find with a holon is that every holon is a whole and a part. And it's never just one of those things. And the entire universe, basically, top to bottom, is made of holons. And so if you look at the whole part of a holon, and you look at the part of a holon, the whole part of a holon is the part that has rights. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean rights conveyed by the state or anything like that. It just means, in the most fundamental sense, if we're looking at a molecule as a whole, then what are the molecule's rights? I mean, when we say a molecule has rights, what would that possibly mean? When you're describing rights, all you're doing is describing the conditions that are necessary to keep the wholeness whole, to keep it intact, to keep it functioning and working. And if you don't have those things, then that wholeness will dissolve. So if we say, well, we have a plant growing, and the plant is a whole, it's also part of other surroundings, but it is a whole. So what are the rights of the plants? Well, you have to water it, it has to have certain nutrients, it has to have sunlight, and so on. And if the plant gets those, its rights, then it can continue to exist as a whole. And so to say something has rights, and those rights go all the way down to quarks and atoms, they also go all the way up as far as you want to take it. What you're doing when you describe rights are simply describing the conditions that holon's wholeness part has to have in order to stay whole. Mm-hmm. Now, those always go with certain responsibilities, because those wholes are always parts of other wholes. And to be a part of a whole means that you have to fit in with that whole. You have to mesh with it somehow. And so, in other words, you have certain duties or certain responsibilities. And again, we don't mean at every whole on every level of complexity has rights and responsibilities, but those will vary enormously depending on, just what the environment is, and whether you're just talking about physical qualities, like what a plant needs to stay alive, that kind of thing, or whether you're actually talking about human rights, like the rights, the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. But when you're talking about duties and responsibilities, by the time you get to a human holon, we are parts of a larger social unit, among other things. And so we do have duties, we do have responsibilities to that. And those can be centrally important. And it also means that there's no such thing as rights without responsibilities, right? Because there's no such thing as wholes that aren't also parts. So the whole notion that we can just have rights or just have responsibilities is insane. And it is true that we have gone, since the 1960s, a little bit heavy on the rights side of the issue. And in part, that's because we were looking at certain minorities that had been marginalized, and we need to approach that carefully, but there's certainly cases where marginalization has occurred. And what that meant was that those people weren't viewed as having a true wholeness themselves. They were just parts that could be moved around and traded and even owned in some cases as property. So we want to say, no, you have rights. And so that means that you have a fundamental right to exist as your own whole entity, not something that belongs to somebody else or that's just a part of something else, and so on. And so we wanted to get those rights. So we passed things with titles like the Civil Rights Act. And that's what we were trying to do. So we're really focusing on rights. Many social commentators think we went too far, and we stopped emphasizing responsibility. And we even stopped talking about it, as if the more rights you had, the less responsibilities you had. Mm-hmm. But that's not true at all. Those two are always interwoven. Mm-hmm. And in a certain sense, the more you have of one, the more you have of another. You have to truly balance those and bring them together. So we even have somebody like Jordan Peterson, who now teaches basically that the only way you're going to get meaning in life is by assuming responsibility. And that's all he teaches in a certain sense. You assume responsibility for your life. You clean your room up. Don't go out telling the culture how it's all screwed up when you can't even take care of your own responsibilities in terms of your own existence. And so those are important, and they permeate all aspects of our life, really. And we certainly see it when we look at things like healthcare, like education. Does a person have a right to those? Or do they have some responsibilities in making that happen? How do we match those? These are difficult issues. Mm-hmm. And one of the problems with social programs is that because people don't have a very integral understanding, because there's not a clear understanding of how everything is a whole on, it's a whole as well as a part, it has rights as well as responsibilities and duties. And so, because that's not an obvious thing to people, they tend to just sort of look at one or look at the other, or if they have their favorite or most problematic issue, they'll tend to emphasize just one, forget about the other, and then they hate anything that is done in terms of social programs. Abortion comes down to which of those wholes has rights, and are we even to consider the fetus a whole? If not, it has no rights. If it is, it has rights. That's the problem. Where does the mother's rights step in as opposed to any rights that a fetus might have? The only thing we know is that to the extent they're both wholes, they both have rights. So that's what has to be figured out. In almost every case, when you end up coming down with some sort of conclusion that you can actually put into play as a social program, and this has certainly been my experience just watching, but I've never seen a social program that was put into place that could just categorically be said that that's the best program and these are all bad. In almost every case, it's the program you're putting into place is the least evil one you can come up with. And the others are just more evil. And that's it. So just get used to it from the start. That's the way it's going. It's true of welfare. It's true for, well, it's just, they're all just variations of disastrous stuff, but we want to make it as least disastrous as possible. And this is particularly the case in terms of getting as large a number of people to be able to get behind a particular program as possible. And so that's a real issue. So what it comes down to, when you look at abortion, is the issue of, are we to consider the fetus a whole in its own right? And if so, then it has a certain amount of rights. And then the question is, okay, certainly the mother is a whole in her own way. She's also a part of several other wholes. And she has a large number of responsibilities and duties, well, just to the society she's in, among other things. If she's part of a family, she'll have responsibilities to that family. If she's part of a teaching program in elementary school, then she has responsibilities that she has to do in order to be part of that organization, and so on. So when we're talking about her being a whole, we're not saying she isn't also part of a whole lot of other things where she has responsibilities. The question is, where do we draw this unit between the mother and the fetus? And is that to be looked at in any way as a kind of dual unity? If that's a genuine wholeness in itself, then both the mother and the fetus are part of that. And the mother has responsibilities at that point. And so that is one of the hotly contested issues, is this fetus anything that deserves in any way its own degree of wholeness? Is it somehow a thing in itself? Or is it just literally nothing more than a clump of cells that a mother has? It's no different than, let's say, her toenail or her appendix or her hair or anything like that. And if that's the case, then those items are just part of her wholeness. She has no responsibility to them in that sense. She certainly wouldn't have any responsibility to a fetus if it was nothing more than just a clump of tissues that are no different from any other non-necessary clump of tissues that the mother might have. The way that this is usually presented in terms of the fundamentalist religious side, even though, as you pointed out, there's not an enormous amount that you can find in things like the Bible that specifically say things about abortion. In part because there weren't readily available ways that it could sort of just be done as a procedure and it would work out. Of course, folk medicine did have certain types of herbs and stuff that you could use and induce labor prematurely, and you do find that. But it's not a constant ongoing issue the way it is with abortion in today's society. And what happened subsequently is that certain, in particular, fundamentalists would simply take it that the moment of conception is the moment that the fetus becomes a genuine soul. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't matter what its actual sort of bodily shape is, even just one single cell, a zygote, that's got a soul. that's a little bit problematic for several reasons. In some cases, it's worth pointing out that there are at least a fair number of religions, and this includes even in their fundamentalist forms, that maintain that the soul doesn't enter the fetus until a couple months after conception. And so even the Catholic Church, for a first, I think it was millennia or so, maintained that the soul didn't enter the fetus for a few months. Even in Islam today, it's maintained, I don't know the exact amount, it's something like 120 days. That's when the soul enters the body, the fetus. So that has to be taken, that has to be put on the table if you're just having a religious argument about this. And certainly if you believe something like reincarnation, that's going to change how you view that whole situation anyway. Because even if you had an abortion, the soul would just get recycled back, get in line again, and come on down. But what we're looking at now are things that, on average, most people in today's society consider to be the case. And so that's how we would tend to look at something like this. You can certainly give political arguments that do go to either of those extremes. And you outline typical ways that happens and typical extremes that people go to. And certainly the sort of extreme fundamentalist, sort of more evangelical far right position is that abortion is simply bad, period.
It's murder.
Yeah, because the fetus has a soul, and it truly is no different from homicide. And in both its criminal, social views, as well as its religious views. And that's a bad thing altogether. At the other extreme, you have the far radical left. And it's to a point, well, recently the governor of Pennsylvania maintained, because of a law that was introduced, Democratic law introduced in Pennsylvania, that you could perform not just a late-term abortion, but you could perform an abortion even after contractions have started and the infant's on its way out. And the governor of Pennsylvania himself, a child doctor, maintained that you could kill the infant after it's been born. And I mean, literally infanticide. And that was part of what this law allowed. And that's clearly so far in one extreme direction that it's, I think that truly is homicide. I think that clearly. Because as you're trying to balance all these different types of viewpoints, and let me say one more. We talked a little bit about one of the things that's happened since the 60s is an almost overemphasis on rights. And there should have been a lot of emphasis on rights, particularly given the number of minorities that didn't have rights. And so that's what we wanted to introduce those for. There was a real reason for that. But then it also kind of caught on in part because of the boomers and being known as the me generation. Then the me generation is going to be highly in favor of rights for them and not so excited about responsibilities. I don't need that. Nobody tells me what to do. I don't have any duties.
Fucking boomers.
So, yeah. So we have that whole tendency that we have to be careful about. And it's real. I mean, as you know, I wrote a whole book called Boomeritis on that kind of thing, which turned out to be an understated.
20 years ahead of its time.
Yeah, weird. But one of the things that that got entered on the rights side of the equation, and there's a fair amount of reasonableness to this, even though it can go too far. But part of it was considering the rights of a woman. And one of the major things that changed, that was part of the change that women began to play in society, and the increasing role that they began to play in society, is not, and again, we've talked a little bit about this, it wasn't that in the past it was nothing but men oppressed women, and that shoved them out of society, and they were always trying to fight back, but men were always holding them down. That's a very, there's partial truth in that, but it's also very lopsided, and there were enormous number of other factors that went into that, including a lot of choices on the part of women. Women have agency, and that's one of the problems. Feminism tends to take agency away from women when they want to say, oh, society made women do this, men made women do this. How about women having agency, making choices themselves? They do, and they were part of the choices that made our past cultures. But and part of it, some of the women themselves didn't want to be in the public sphere, or to be to have the vote, for example, because when you got the vote in most Western cultures, you were expected to fight in war, and women didn't want to do that. And it was still one of the concerns that women had, by the way, when the Equal Rights Amendment was attempted to be put through. They felt that they actually had some special rights, and that the Equal Rights Amendment would take that away from them. And so it turned out that the Equal Rights Amendment was defeated because a majority of men voted for it and a majority of women voted against it. So that wasn't men oppressing women. We have to be very careful about that. But and there was oppression that occurred. One of the things that had the greatest impact on freeing women from being stuck in some of those earlier roles were indeed the impacts that came in the 1960s, and not just from things like the Civil Rights Act. It was things like the birth control pill. It was things like having abortion more readily available, because these things were just being pregnant, and all of the responsibilities that demands, because now you're part of a unit. It's not just you, there's another member in that unit. And as a part of that unit, you have responsibilities. And that's one of the things that really kept mothers limited in what specifically they could do. So as all of that started happening, this was an enormous, if you want to see women, not so much oppressed by men, but confined by their previous roles. Men, by the way, were extremely confined by their roles as well as the disposable sex. But one of the things that really helped women was the not having to be a mother, not being forced to go through that, and the 20 years or so out of your life it's going to take if you continue the responsibilities of a mother. And so that continues to be an important part of what a more feminist-oriented viewpoint takes into account, And that's one of the reasons that even that extreme version of, well, what it's saying when you can say unlimited abortion all the way up through right when you're conceiving is, I refuse to acknowledge that I am part of a holon that includes the fetus. The fetus doesn't have its own wholeness. It doesn't have rights. I'm the only whole here. I'm the only autonomous person here. I'm the only one that has rights here. And therefore, my rights are, I can get rid of that fetus in the same way I can clip my fingernails. I mean, that's literally the way it's viewed. And so that's coming not just from a narcissistic overemphasis on just my rights and me, although there is some of that. But it's also just keeping in account the enormous freedom that being able to be free from motherhood gave the average woman. In other words, it protected her autonomy. It kept her wholeness whole. So she didn't have to be a part of some other whole to which she had responsibilities. And that's one of the main drives of feminism, was to get women out of roles where they were simply a part of a larger unit and they had responsibilities, whether it was to their husbands or whether it was to some traditional roles that society stuck them in. They wanted their own autonomy. They wanted to be their own whole that wasn't a part of those other wholes. And that's a central issue that's facing women in the whole abortion debate. I know very, very few women who have had abortions and are proud of it.
That's right.
For every woman that I've talked to that's had it, it's a horrifying ordeal. They hate it. They wish to God's heaven that they didn't have to do it. But they look at that whole 20-year stretch of their life and their own autonomy in that life. And many of them, for example, can't afford, they're trying to get an education. They can't afford that. They're trying to get a job. They don't yet have that. And they're looking at all the things that can impinge on that autonomy, on that wholeness, and the things that can take away from it. And a child takes away from that wholeness about as much as pretty much anything will. And some of them just can't see their life that impacted by that kind of responsibility. And so they need to maintain the right to just be considered nothing but a whole in themselves and not part of a unit that includes a fetus. Because then the fetus has rights and they have responsibilities. And that's one of the issues that's running through their minds. So I just thought, even though I'm a man, that I would try to give that viewpoint, at least as best as I can understand it, because I think it is serious. I think it is real. It's not to say it's 100% right, but it is real. It is there, and it's a serious concern. So it comes back then to, okay, under what conditions would we, just using general principles that we accept elsewhere, what conditions would we consider the fetus to be itself a whole? Not the same as having a soul, we're setting aside the religion for now, but just when can a fetus be considered a whole in its own being? Mm-hmm. And whenever we decide that is, then it becomes a holon with some sort of rights. And then that's when we had to decide, okay, does that right include the right to life?
Right.
And then if so, then we have to start looking at how to curtail abortion in some ways and to some degree, simply because we're acknowledging the rights that that fetus has,
Mhm.
and that the rights to be considered a whole in its own being. And so it looks like that the best possible type of compromise that we have, in terms of both acknowledging some degree of that trajectory from fetus to a birthed human.
Mhm.
At some point in that trajectory, the fetus takes on a wholeness that has a right to life.
Mhm.
And the mother is a part of that dual unity. She has responsibilities at that point, not just to a fingernail, but to a living thing. And the death of that living thing is coming into the category of homicide.
Right. Right.
And so the best compromise, and it is a compromise, but I think it's probably, if you had to force both sides to come to an agreement, I think this is the one most of them would come to. And it's fairly well accepted, at least generally, if a person's forced to take their second choice on what to do about abortion. And that is, when does it reach viability, basically? And that, of course, keeps going back a bit and back a bit. It's not a perfect solution because it's viable. What viability really means in these circumstances, it's viable outside the mother's body. It's not viable. I mean, you just can't put it out there and let it run around. And if you have to hook it up usually to some machines and stuff to keep it going. But the point is, now it's a part of another whole on that doesn't include the mother. And so that comes out, it varies. It was 26 weeks, now it's sort of 24 weeks. Some people would see it pushing down to 22 weeks, sometime around there. But it's still looking like, just generically, that in the first 2 trimesters, it's not viable.
Right.
And so therefore, we can't say that as a self-supporting living being, that it has its own wholeness yet. And so abortions would be allowed up to that point. And then last trimester abortions would be only under the severest health threats to the mother.
Yeah, those late-term abortions would only be available when the wholeness of either the fetus or the wholeness of the mother is under threat. So right. The mother's life could end, or the baby could be born with all sorts of birth defects or whatever. That is, it's not going to last very long outside of the womb anyway. And again, for these types of abortions, just to remind everyone again, only 1.3% of abortions take place after 24 weeks. And the vast, 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 vast majority of those are when it comes to health risks for the mother or viability for the baby. So Ken, it sounds like status quo. I mean, this is really the status quo we sort of have right now, is sort of the best way to proceed. And, I just hope the Supreme Court maintains that stance and over the decades to come. And, one interesting thing I think is really, when you started talking about the question of, when does soul move in? On the one hand, this does sound like a very sort of mythological, amber kind of question, but there's an integral way to ask that question too, which is, you have a whole section on this that we have on the website, which is your hypothesis of subtle energies.
Right.
Embryology in particular is so interesting because it is such a rapid developmental sequence. I mean, we're literally going from a single cell to an entire organism in such a small space of time that, a lot happens during the interim. And the main question seems to be, at what point in that trajectory has the physical matter become sufficiently complex to begin to become a conduit for these subtle and causal energies that you hypothesize.
Right.
That, you know, so we would think anyway, that is when some degree of interiority begins to come online for the fetus while in the womb. And, you know, anyone who's had a kid has, you know, some of their happiest memories are talking to the kid inside the womb and feeling it respond. And it's like, wow, there's an actual life form in there. And of course, that's only possible once that child has developed, you know, up to at minimally the level of irritability in the 4 quadrants.
Right.
But that's when the interiority really starts to come online. And it's a fascinating question that I'm not sure anyone has an answer to, but when you combine embryology with the theory of subtle energies, it gets really, really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely.